The Western world seems to be changing in the blink of an eye, as an international system that has endured for almost a century appears to be on its way out. Meanwhile, President Donald Trump insists that there is a plan for a new world order, but only after he completely breaks the existing one. And that goes beyond mere fiscal concerns. It extends to the much larger realm of the structure of international relations, full of important physical institutions that have set the agenda ever since most of us have been alive. The Trump revolution has its critics, of course. They are especially prominent regarding his economic plans, and at least in this domain, the criticism there is straightforwardly articulated. Prices will go up, and that is bad for consumers. But prominent criticisms of Trump doctrine on the other dimensions, particularly as it relates to territorial expansion, are a bit of a mess. Sure, the West has enjoyed a long period of territorial peace, but with that has come a sense of complacency. When the disruptor-in-chief looks to upend the system, the articulated response is weak. You see, simply telling the president and his friends that they should feel bad for even making the suggestion is not a compelling argument to anyone who is unsure of what to make of it. It may play well to the Democratic base or worldwide audiences, but for those close to Trump or otherwise inclined to follow him, it is just too easy to brush off the shame on you criticisms. It seems that, somewhere along the way, the West forgot why the territorial peace made sense in the first place, including for countries that had a single-minded goal to enrich themselves as much as possible. What we really need to understand is why this shift works against 80 years of economic realities, never mind tens of thousands of years of human progress. And thus we have a clear task for today. This is why the West stopped fighting over territory, or previously did anyway. Let's rewind and begin with a prologue on the history of territorial conquest. You see, for most of world history, the textbooks tell us of a seemingly never-ending series of territorial conquests. Whether we are talking about the Roman Empire of ancient times, the British colonial period, manifest destiny within the United States, Nazi Germany seeking all of Europe, Imperial Japan pressing to the Asian mainland, or the Soviet domination of Eastern Europe during the Cold War. There are still traces of this today, of course, and the Russian invasion of Ukraine is here to remind anyone who may have forgotten. But not too long ago, something weird started to happen in the Western world. Those countries collectively seemed to stop caring about expanding their borders. Sure, there still are some disputes, either current or recent. Hans Island between Canada and Greenland is a good starting point. It is that rock in the midst of chunks of ice. You have Pheasant Island between Spain and France, in a relatively populated area. Then there is the dispute between the Netherlands and Germany, where the Ems River dumps into the North Sea system. We can also get Asia involved with the Lioncourt Rocks, controlled by South Korea to the extent that rocks can be administered, but also claimed by Japan. And yes, Japan and South Korea are a part of the broader Western coalition. Or how about the Rockall Islands, perfectly positioned so that Iceland, Ireland, Denmark, and the United Kingdom can all get mad over it. And then you have a mountaintop between France and Italy, and, staying in the same neighborhood, a lake disputed among Germany, Switzerland, and Austria, to the extent that Google does not even bother trying to mark it, a town between Spain and Portugal, and, again, same neighborhood, an isthmus along Gibraltar between Spain and the United Kingdom. However, no one is about to fight a war over any of these. All of that nebulous, feel-good stuff you hear in international diplomacy actually holds here. Well, no, that is not true. Remember Hans Island? Denmark and Canada fought the Whiskey War over it from 1973 to 2022. Now, if you're thinking to yourself, I do not remember Denmark and Canada exchanging blows in my lifetime, never mind a conflict that lasted about 50 years. Well, you are right. And that is sort of the point. The Whiskey War featured a series of battles where one side would visit the island, plant its flag, and leave a potent potable behind for the opponent, whiskey from Canada and schnapps from Denmark. Then the other side would come by and replace the flag with its own. The war became a joke, a cute, friendly rivalry rather than something worth sending people to their graves over. And if you will permit me to draw a line on a map, this is the border that they settled on in June 2022. The timing notable because they were intentionally dunking on Russia and the Kremlin's motives underlying the invasion of Ukraine. A taunt that the West knows how to solve territorial conflicts, but they do not. Meanwhile, Pheasant Island alternates ownership based on the calendar. February through July for Spain, and August through January for France. Okay, to be fair, that one is a historical legacy of the 30 Years' War. But the resolution to that river dispute typifies the broader trend. In 2014, the Netherlands and Germany met and agreed to stop caring. Literally. The border remains ambiguous, and the pair of countries now jointly administer it. Anyone living in Europe, or who has traveled to the continent, understands the broader laissez-faire attitude toward territorial borders at this point. Visa-free travel to almost the entire European Union renders a good portion of border questions irrelevant. Heck, the vast majority of their militaries have collectivized to some degree under the NATO banner, even if NATO itself does not technically have an army. Indeed, somewhere along the way, territorial indifference became so normal that it grew into Western culture. Again, the attitude is that not only is territorial conquest bad, but you should feel bad about it yourself for even considering the possibility. Well, that is all fine and good when the system is working. It does not matter too much if compliance with the territorial peace is due to cultural norms or an active understanding of the economic incentives. The end product is the same: peace on Earth. But then someone comes along and threatens to make Canada the 51st state, or he threatens to annex Greenland for military development, protection over a Northwest Passage, and the harvesting of its natural resources, or he threatens to take possession of the Panama Canal to reclaim an earlier investment, or he even suggests turning the Gaza Strip into the next Riviera. And suddenly pointing to a norm just does not cut it. You see, when others object, and that certain someone comes back with, well, why not? Further retorts of, because, and we don't do that anymore, and you should feel bad, tend to fall on deaf ears. At that point, it sure would be nice to have some more tangible answers. Well, maybe we can get some. Chapter 1. The Origins of the Peace. Some of the territorial peace was by design, but the norm has evolved well beyond what anyone originally had in mind. To see the progression, we must go back to the beginning, and, ironically, the end of World War II. There were 5 major power winners of the conflict: the United States, the United Kingdom, France, China, and the Soviet Union. However, only the United States' homeland remained unscathed. The Soviet Union, invaded and mostly destroyed. China, invaded and mostly destroyed, also about to experience a civil war. France, invaded and destroyed. United Kingdom, not invaded, but bombed to the point of misery, also about to experience a period of decolonization. Now, the war had come to Pearl Harbor one December morning, but it never went any further. The result was Washington holding unparalleled power in the moment and hitting its overall historic peak. Not even the post-Cold War moment of American unipolarity could hold a candle to the post-victory in Japan situation. In 1945, the United States was outspending the United Kingdom by a factor of 5 militarily. Compared to the Soviet Union, it was 10. Washington controlled half of the world's wealth and was about to take control over the world's major financial levers. Only about 400,000 Americans died during the war. For the United Kingdom, it was 450,000, but at 3 times the casualty-to-population ratio. For France, it was 600,000, showing once more the problem with being invaded. A worse situation, though, is being invaded and fighting back. That is how the Soviet Union ended up at 20-something million, a number so large that even trying to calculate a precise figure is a fool's errand. The point is that the United States was the world's dominant force. The buck indeed stopped in the Oval Office. And that does not begin to factor in the nuclear monopoly that it would hold for the following 4 years. However, the advantageous American position was not going to last forever. The other countries were going to rebuild and bring some balance back to the great game. As such, the United States had a brief window to decide how to shape post-war politics. The grand strategy pursued attempted to implement the lessons learned from the failures of the World War I settlement. Following the Entente's victory, the Treaty of Versailles imposed harsh reparations payments on Germany and other punitive measures, including territorial exchanges. This paved the way for a general discontent in Germany and a period of hyperinflation. Better dance quickly, because by the time your song ends, the value of your marks may have halved. To see what I mean, in 1922, $1 US could purchase 160 marks. Less than 2 years later, that same dollar could purchase 4,200 marks, with 9 trailing zeros. Yep, that is 4.2 trillion marks. The currency was no longer worth the paper that it was printed on. Some chose to use it as a wallpaper instead. You would have to take wheelbarrows full of cash to buy anything. Of course smoking was verboten here. An errant flame was a giant fire hazard with this much tinder sitting around. Imagine a world where a 5 trillion note had to be put into circulation, and trying to update prices on the fly when even that was not good enough. The period of hyperinflation paved the way for the rise of Adolf Hitler, and we all know the rest of that story. Well before entering the war, the United States looked to ensure that those mistakes would not be repeated. In 1941, the United States and the United Kingdom issued the Atlantic Charter, which sketched out what the post-war order would look like in 3 parts: an end of territorial expansionism, the lowering of trade barriers, and the freedom of navigation worldwide. The first one sounded like an idealist pipe dream. The other 2 had direct justification and were easier to gather support for. And one of them has surprising relevance for today's political situation. In 1930, the Republican-controlled House of Representatives, in an effort to alleviate the effects of the Great Depression, passed the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, which raised tariffs in an effort to collect more revenue for the federal government. It did not work, and the United States sank deeper into the Great Depression. By the 1940s, economists recognized that tariffs had distorted business incentives and were generally bad for consumers. Thus, killing tariffs and promoting international trade became a priority for the Atlantic partners, and would be a key part of their strategy against an upcoming threat. Meanwhile, freedom of navigation was merely a component of that. You cannot engage in transcontinental trade if your ships are going to come under attack. It is the reason that the United States launched Operation Ocean Shield many decades later to root out Somali pirates around the Horn of Africa, and then more than a decade after that initiated Operation Prosperity Guardian to halt Yemeni Houthis from targeting ships along the Bab el-Mandab Strait. If the United States was willing to foot the bill to establish freedom of navigation, everyone else was happy to free ride and still enjoy the public good. Now, the idea of economic interdependence was not new. Immanuel Kant and his idealist hope of a perpetual peace introduced it as a theory way back in the 18th century. In application, prior to World War I, some believed that Europe was so financially integrated that no one would dare start a war to disrupt that. One assassination later, though, and the belief was not looking so good. However, the United States planned to take the theory of economic interdependence to a whole new level. Rather than try to maintain its privileged position over its allies, continue dominating its vanquished opponents, and launch a new empire, the United States implemented the Marshall Plan, named for Secretary of State George Marshall. It called for everyone in Europe to be rebuilt from the ground up. And, as if to eliminate any doubt about how poorly designed World War I's Treaty of Versailles was, the Marshall Plan extended to West Germany, the primary loser of the war, which ultimately took the third most aid after the United Kingdom and France. Japan received the same treatment from a different set of funds, again being rebuilt into an economic powerhouse. It was almost as though, if your country was facing an economic calamity, the best thing to do was declare war against the United States, intentionally lose, and then rake in the aid dollars. Part of what convinced Western countries to go along with the system and lay down their burdens was that the United States was a democracy, and that any attempt to exploit the system would quickly be detected. It is the central tension within any democracy. You will be bad at keeping secrets, but good at making credible commitments. Another component was Washington's willingness to institutionalize the system, be that financially through the International Monetary Fund or militarily through NATO. But what really sold the system was a looming threat: the Soviet Union. Once wartime allies, the United States had hoped that maybe, just maybe, the Soviet Union would also buy into the new liberal order. However, as it became increasingly clear that the world was gearing up for the next ideological battle, Western Europe needed a protector. Washington was willing to fill that role. In 1947, a report from the fledgling CIA stated that the greatest danger to the security of the United States was the possibility of economic collapse in Western Europe and the consequent accession to power of communist elements. It was not just that poor countries would be more vulnerable to a Soviet invasion, which, of course, was still a natural concern. Tanks and bombs cost money. But it was also that economic uncertainty would give rise to communist sympathizers and threats from the inside, which would then threaten the United States. Hence the great lengths that Washington was willing to take, like the Marshall Plan from earlier, or the Berlin airlift that would occur later. All that the United States wanted in return was those countries' assistance in countering the Soviet threat, and they could afford to help once the US assistance had rebuilt their economies. For their part, Western European countries were happy to agree to the deal. On August 24, 1949, 12 countries signed the North Atlantic Treaty, committing to protect one another in the event of an attack on any of them. The first Secretary General of NATO, Lord Hastings Ismay, famously once said that the point of the organization was to keep the Soviet Union out, the Americans in, and the Germans down. He was wrong on the third point. West Germany became the 15th member of NATO in 1955. But 2 out of 3 ain't bad. All told, Washington had a seemingly radical plan for the brave new world. Yet even the staunchest of its advocates could not have anticipated what would become of the system. Chapter 2: A Brief History of Predatory Economic Governance, or, alternatively, the hold-up problem. It is easy to think that the Western order codified its rules within Western institutions, but Washington had an even bigger platform in mind. Indeed, the United Nations became the chief organization for international law, dictating that all members shall refrain in their international relations from the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state. This is an international law, though, and the problem there is that international laws are international laws. When someone breaks them, an international police does not go storming down the streets of the corresponding capital to arrest its leader, even if the mental image of that is humorous. Rather, it is up to the states to self-enforce the rules, meaning the countries themselves, not the international institution. For the Western coalition, the external threat of the Soviet Union was a good starting point to get self-enforcement to work. Trying to beat the Soviets would not work so well if you were too busy chasing each other around. But there was also a strong internal incentive to collectively punish any country violating the new norm by attempting to impose extractive measures against a fellow Western country. Let's rewind. No, let's really rewind. For most of human history, capital investment was an afterthought. This was not an issue with business acumen, though. The problem was out on the fields. Sad to say, farmers were nowhere near as good at their jobs as they are today. Even if they spent all day, every day in the fields, humanity collectively could barely produce enough calories to cover everyone's dietary needs. Improving the situation was not easy. Without a large calorie surplus, few had the time to work on improving agriculture rather than actually working in the fields. To wit, it may have taken around 10,000 years to figure out how to get animals to pull a plow, never mind the complex machines that now dominate modern-day agriculture. Surplus wealth to make investments that could further improve productivity was also hard to come by, precisely because there was little agricultural surplus. As a result, the gross world product hardly increased year over year, both in terms of agricultural output or otherwise. By the end of World War II, though, that was no longer the case. Agricultural revolutions had made humanity's dietary needs simple. The fraction of labor dedicated to food production was dropping, and it was about to fall even further over the next few decades. As a result, the West was transitioning into an era where not only was capital investment possible, it was the norm, and necessary to fuel broader economic growth. But therein lied a problem. Imagine the plight of an entrepreneur who has a fantastic business idea that will surely succeed. All he needs is a couple of years of time to solidify the idea, and a smidgen of capital to get the idea off the ground. Sadly, though, despite the camo that he is cosplaying in, he is a weak and timid keyboard warrior. Meanwhile, a big bad bandit lives next door to him. And to make matters worse, the bandit really likes money, as they normally do. Think about what happens if the entrepreneur invests time and capital into the project. It will be a major success, but the bandit will see his success, come knocking on his door, and then take all of his money. Anticipating that inevitability, it hardly makes sense to make the investment at all, knowing that the entrepreneur will bear all of the costs, but that the bandit will enjoy all of the benefits. This is known as a hold-up problem, and it is an economic nightmare. The issue here is not just that the bandit steals money from our dear author. That would only be a transfer of wealth, an injustice to be sure, but not a problem for mankind's collective welfare. At least in that case, the books would get written, readers would be happy, and the bandit would also be happy. The author? Well, sucks to be him, but I am sure that he will land on his feet. However, that is not what happens. The bandit holds up the investment, thereby preventing any economic growth from happening at all. The world could have had this much extra value injected into it, if only the bandit were not there. But he is there, so this wealth is not created, and everyone ends up worse off for it. One could succinctly summarize much of the political history of mankind as trying to address this problem. During prehistory, the first governments formed to protect farmers from roving bandits, who would otherwise steal the local harvests. That allowed the meager investment of agriculture to happen at all, giving rise to civilization as a concept. One problem: those governments specialized in violence. They were set up to protect farmers from roving bandits, yet they ultimately became stationary bandits, taking shelter behind thick walls of castles, and using the threat of violence to consume whatever surpluses the farmers produced. Now, they were not fully extractive. They had to leave enough left over so that the farmers, well, let's call them peasants at this point, could survive into the next year. This was not out of benevolence, of course. A deceased peasant would be unable to produce any crops the following year, and thus be unable to pay any tribute. Thus, it was better than the roving bandits that would destroy everything in their path, but it was not much of an improvement. The next evolution was establishing some level of control over government. Enter the era of the Magna Carta, a step in the right direction, but ultimately a way for feudal lords to withhold money from the king and capture more of the profits for themselves. Many centuries later, the start of freedom from government happened. Indeed, this is one of the explanations for the American Revolution. Remember, War itself is a puzzle. If you can estimate what the expected outcome of a war would look like, then you could just implement something close to that outcome immediately. Both sides would be better off agreeing to that than engaging in the conflict, given that war will destroy some portion of the value at stake. Part of what broke this system during the American colonial era was the specter of taxation from the crown constraining New World investment. Removing King George III's influence from the continent would allow the colonial economy to grow free from predation, and the value added would outpace any losses incurred through fighting. Put differently, yes, the revolution was an inefficient conflict resolution mechanism, but if the efficiency gains made by freeing the colonies from predation were even greater than that, then the traditional bargaining range we know and love disappears entirely. You get war until one side gives up on the mission, which is exactly what happened. Afterward, democratic institutions within the United States would protect future entrepreneurs from similar concerns, though it would be a bit before that concept fully filtered down. And, in the meantime, there were some Americans who thought that the only proper tax was no tax at all, giving rise to whiskey rebellions and the like. Eventually, they settled on a middle ground, with recognition that governments need funds to provide some public goods. Those public goods in turn subsidize further investment and more than make up for extractive distortions. Fast forward almost 2 centuries, and most Western countries had adopted similar institutional protections. Compare that to a country like North Korea, which retains extractive institutions that so inhibited economic growth that the country is barely visible from space at night. You have Pyongyang and not much else. Now, good governance may have solved internal holdup problems, but external holdup problems still persisted. In interstate conflict, the implicit taxation here is not a number set by a formal law. It is informal, hard to see or measure, and it gets worse the weaker that you are. You calculate it as the expected percentage that could be acquired by the opponent through war, and what can be captured through war increases as the opponent's military strength increases. So if you had a 50% risk of getting taken over, then keeping the peace requires an implicit tax of about 50%. Yet here was the United States, the most powerful country in the world, promising not to do that. Not 50%, not nothing. All that you had to do was promise not to threaten the United States or your neighbors with the same type of extraction. Collectively, the system created self-enforcing incentives. Sure, you could break the rule and try to coerce a fellow state in the system, but then the rest of the countries involved could terminate their respect for your own property rights. Or, alternatively, they could decide to abandon promises to protect you from the external threat. Good luck to you dealing with any communist invasion on your own. All of that combined meant that the West had resolved its intra-Western holdup problems. The Soviet Union remained a threat, of course, but NATO was still around to address that. Remember, implicit taxation is a function of vulnerability to invasion. The whole point of NATO was to build a barrier to prevent that from happening. All told, the West was entering an unparalleled period of investment returns, and the directions that they would take with it were previously unheard of. Chapter 3: A Brief History of International Trade. For the vast majority of human history, the international trade that we think of as a standard part of life today, or at least was a standard part of life not too long ago, was economically irrelevant. Remember, back on the prehistoric farm, there was hardly any calorie surplus created. Almost everyone was producing food. And there had to be an overemphasis on vegetables and cereals, because meat was tasty but inefficient to produce. To pay someone to move goods from one country to another rather than produce more calories was a tough ask if you couldn't even produce meat. Moreover, the vast majority of what could be traded was food being grown elsewhere. While it is nice by modern standards to introduce some variety into your diet, that was a low priority when hitting calorie consumption targets was difficult. The trade of U.S. apples for Central American bananas for Mexican limes is a modern-day luxury. Welcome to Limes on Maps, by the way. But whether we are eating those limes, bananas, apples, or something else, this kind of dietary variety is only possible because we have the surplus wealth to spend on it. Okay, maybe not the eggs anymore, but you get the idea. We are comparatively rich now. In contrast, back in the day, international trade was confined to the elites, and even then, it was a microscopic component of the global economy. In turn, foregone trade was essentially irrelevant to the calculation of whether to initiate a war. Eventually, technological improvements to farming and transportation created both the surplus labor and capacity to move large quantities of goods across vast distances. However, trade disproportionately consisted of finished goods, European glassware for Chinese porcelain as an example. This was not the era of steamships or the Suez Canal. It would take months for a crew to go from Europe to Asia. And that was only after they found a way to get over there in the first place. But even with that knowledge, you could not ping-pong raw materials, middle inputs, and finished products back and forth. It would simply take too long and cost too much to produce most goods like that. Pushing later into history, there were some cases of unstreamlined supply chains. For example, the American South produced cotton, and British textile mills spun it together to create clothing. But that could only happen in cases where the comparative advantages were extreme. Well, in today's economy, things move fast enough that we can exploit even slight comparative advantages. Take the Airbus 380 plane as an example. We're going to need a map of Europe here. Good. Its rear fuselage and vertical tail fin were manufactured in Hamburg, Germany. For its horizontal tail fin, it had to go to Cadiz, Spain. For its wings, Broughton, Wales. The engine had many of its parts built in the United Kingdom, and it may have been assembled there too, though it is possible that the assembly happened in Singapore instead. Meanwhile, for its forward fuselage, center fuselage, and final assembly, it was a bunch of sites in France. Of course, that is just the main structure of the plane. It ignores where its overall 4 million components are sourced. For example, those engines again? They may have the fingerprints of Pratt & Whitney or General Electric, two American companies. And just so we're clear, the Airbus 380 is not unique. Let's look at a Boeing 787. Forward fuselage, Japan or the United States. Landing gear, France. Center fuselage, Italy. The wing-to-body connector, United States. The wing, Japan. Except for the leading edge, that is the United States. And the wingtips are from South Korea as well. Meanwhile, the back part may be American, Canadian, or Australian. The engine nacelles, United States, though the engine itself may have come from the United Kingdom. The lithium-ion batteries they charge, Japan. Rear fuselage, United States. Passenger door, France. Horizontal stabilizer, Italy. Tail fin, United States. Rudder, China. And cargo access doors, Sweden. All sold by an American company to a Dutch company. Or maybe it was a Canadian company, or an Ethiopian company, or a Qatari company, or an Emirati company, or a Kiwi company, I think that's how you say it, or a Japanese company, or a British company, or an Israeli company, or a Turkish company, or a Singaporean company, or a Vietnamese company, or an Uzbek company, or a Tahitian company, or an Omani company. Oh man, the modern economy, huh? How do we get to a system that looks as crazy as this? Well, two technological developments are worth highlighting here. The first is oil. It is difficult to find another substance with as much potential energy per gallon. Mastery over combustion engines gave rise to increasingly large commercial ships, capable of efficiently transporting goods from one side of the globe to the other. In fact, gasoline production is the perfect microcosm for the specialization of labor at the heart of this chapter. You may be aware that the United States has become the world's largest crude oil producer, so much so that it is now a net exporter. Yet, the United States is not energy independent in any real sense. It still imports about 8.5 million barrels of crude per day. It is just simultaneously exporting 10 million barrels per day. Confused? Yeah, it is weird. The trick here is chemistry and skill. The United States is blessed with an abundance of light sweet crude oil, so named because of its low sulfur content and its sweet taste, for those silly enough to swash oil around their mouths. This abundance is a relatively new development, thanks to a separate technological advance in fracking. It is the most valuable crude oil on the market because it is easy to refine. Anyone in the refining business can do it. However, chemists in the United States are especially good at their jobs. Putting them to work on refining the light, sweet stuff would be a waste of their talents. As a result, the United States dispenses its own light, sweet crude to the international market, with Mexico, China, and Canada being the top recipients, and 70% of it going elsewhere. It then purchases heavy sour oil from the same international market on the cheap. Slightly more than half of that comes from Canada, and another 11% comes from Mexico. It is a complicated dance to be sure, but because American chemists can handle that stuff, the United States effectively pockets the spread on the price. Technological innovation number 2 appears more basic on the surface, as if investors could have created it centuries ago. But that does not change its importance. Meet the ISO 668 Series 1 freight container, classification, dimensions, and ratings, or what a normal human would just call a shipping container. Now, I know what you were thinking. It is just a box. A sturdy box to be sure, but still a box at the end of the day. And while that may excite someone sneaking around Shadow Moses Island, what makes the shipping container a major innovation is not so much its design, but rather the ISO attached in front of its technical name. You see, it has an International Organization for Standards classification because all shipping containers are supposed to meet certain design requirements. Standardization means that every container ship in the world can hoist every one of these boxes on board. It also means that every port that the ship arrives at can offload the containers and handle the containers afterward, including in as far-flung of places as Antarctica. It also means that every cargo-carrying train can latch it to the rails. It also means that every shipping truck can hitch it to its final destination. And it also means that someone else afterward will want to use that same shipping container again. It was not always like this. Prior to the adoption of the ISO 668 in the 1960s and 1970s, shipping was done on an ad hoc basis. Everything chartered for an ocean voyage would show up in whatever boxes someone saw fit to pack their goods, and it would be up to the longshoremen to play Tetris to get everything to fit on the ship. Even then, it was easy to leave behind wasted space. To make matters worse, it could take 2 weeks to load and offload a ship. Good luck sending anything perishable. And never mind that they could not stack nearly as much stuff when the goods were not uniform. Shipping containers have also cut down on theft by the longshoremen. It is much harder to steal something or have something get lost out of an anonymous box than when the products are loose and clearly visible. Today, the longshoremen can stack simple boxes as high as possible, while the Tetris experts can go back to focusing on reaching the kill screen. The 4x1 always was the best piece, and what is a shipping container if not a 4x1 block? As a result, I can send a shipping container from the shores of North Carolina, United States of America, to Brisbane, Australia, for only $4,239. That is probably more than what you have in your wallet right now, but think about how many books could fit into a single shipping container. Or how about t-shirts? A shipping container can hold about 80,000 of the world's most basic fashion item. That is a whole 5.3 cents per shirt. Think about it. A shirt from the east coast of the United States, through the Panama Canal, and across the world's largest ocean, all for a little more than a nickel, tariffs not included. The result of this is that widgets tend to be mass-produced wherever it is cheapest to do so, and then the magic of international commerce eventually gets them where they need to go, assuming that the seas are open to navigation, which is why the United States spends so much time on maintaining safe passage. And by the cheapest place to produce things, textiles or otherwise, I mean the place with the lowest opportunity cost. Some might think that a hypothetical country that is superior at producing every product imaginable would not benefit from international trade. Those people would be wrong. Imagine that the only things that Americans wanted to produce were baseballs and dice. And let's further imagine that through the wizardry of American ingenuity, every American employed in this economy could produce either 12 baseballs or 12 dice over one day of labor. And perhaps Mexico too only wants baseballs and dice. However, their skills are a bit different. A day of labor could produce either 2 baseballs or 10 dice. An American looking at the situation might think to himself that Uncle Sam has no need for Mexico here. Sure, Adam Smith could tell you that if Mexico could counterfactually produce, say, 20 baseballs per day of labor to the United States' static number of 12, then each country would have a different absolute advantage, and trade would therefore make sense. With die production looking like this, have the United States produce dice, and have Mexico produce baseballs. Everyone wins. But as it stands, production capacity looks like this, and every day of labor up north produces either 10 more baseballs or 2 more dice. The US is superior in every way. It is therefore easy to conclude that the United States could build a wall and not think twice about the relationship. Well, not so fast. In practice, of course, consumers in both countries like a mix of products. Let's imagine that a wall prevents any trade from happening. Then you might imagine that labor is split across the country such that, on average, 6 baseballs and 6 dice are being made per American, while 1 baseball and 5 dice are being made per Mexican. Cue David Ricardo coming back from the dead to tell us that we can do better. Suppose instead that we reassigned every Mexican to focus on dice and dice alone. Meanwhile, because Americans really do enjoy dice quite a bit, we keep a quarter of the American workforce in that sector, but we pump up the baseball sector to 75% of the economy. Now every Mexican is producing 10 dice per day of labor, while Americans on average are producing 9 baseballs and 3 dice per day of labor. Do you see where this is going? Let's break the wall down. Freed from that constraint, Americans could trade 2 baseballs for 4 dice. Now total consumption per standardized unit is 7 baseballs for the United States, as well as 7 dice in that country, and 2 baseballs and 6 dice in Mexico. Compare that to before, and shockingly, consumption on every metric has increased. That is the magic of comparative advantage. Let's go back to the original rates of production per hour. Sure, in this example, the United States can outproduce Mexico on every single metric. But for Mexico to produce just 1 baseball, it must forego 5 dice. In contrast, on the other side, producing a baseball only requires the United States to sacrifice 1 die. The crazy thing is that you will always be able to find a way to improve consumption, no matter how the distribution of production works, except in the rare case that the ratios are exactly the same. In the original example, Mexico's opportunity cost for producing baseballs was high. Thus, if it specialized in die production, more stuff could be produced, and overall welfare would increase. And that was with the unrealistic assumption of American superiority on every front. In reality, there are things that the United States just cannot produce, like coffee. Circling back, the Airbus 380 was not some sort of isolated example of these gains from trade in action. The various component pieces of cars manufactured in the United States, for example, will travel across the Canadian and Mexican borders many times before their final assembly. Even NATO does this now with its military supply chains. It is just how developed economies work. Thinking about the big picture, you should not just worry about the loss of traditional gains from trade with apples, bananas, limes, and maple syrup. Instead, you should worry that fighting a war against another country within your supply chain will also shut down your economy, and perhaps even your weapons production capacity. Pressing the big red button against a neighbor is almost like pressing the big red button against yourself. It is like nuclear mutually assured destruction on a smaller scale. But it also means that France starting a war with Germany will disrupt supply chains for the United Kingdom and weaken it vis-a-vis Russia. That encourages third parties to crack down on norm violators. One, to get them to stop their aggressive antics as soon as possible, and two, to deter anyone else from thinking about replicating the idea. At this point, you might be thinking to yourself, hold up problems and supply chain logistics. Sounds great. But this is a video about the Western territorial piece, and all we have discussed so far is why war in general has become more expensive. There is nothing here specifically about territory. To that, I say yes. So far. Chapter 4. A brief history of service economies. Let's go back to that dominant period of human history, when almost everyone worked in agriculture. It was good to be a part of the tiny ruling class. Not only did the peasants have little choice but to work non-stop at the risk of going hungry, it was also straightforward to monitor their compliance with the work structure. You see, up until recently, farming practices were not complicated. It was easy to observe whether peasants were working or not. It was also easy to verify come harvest time whether they had been productive, purely by measuring the quantities delivered. Think about the incentives for conquest that this created. All you had to do to extract value out of land was remove whichever lord currently presided over the area. It became your fiefdom, and the laborers living there would not have much choice but to continue working the land, and paying you whatever surpluses they managed. You did not need to leave behind an extensive physical presence, or even speak the language properly. You could hire some locals to manage the details on your behalf. Moreover, you could choose an ethnic minority, or better yet, craft an ethnic minority that did not previously exist, to play the role of middle manager. They would have no hope of staying within the ruling hierarchy without your military backing. Thus, they would be loyal to you and keep the tribute flowing. It was the prime time for territorial conquest, and it was quite profitable, as long as you could control your empire. The same incentive structure exists for lootable natural resources. Think diamond mines. You can observe whether your laborers are working, and reward or punish accordingly. Putting this together, you can observe what is happening, you can easily calculate outputs, and you can readily punish non-compliers. Indeed, this recipe for conquest continues to exacerbate civil wars in the poorer regions of the world, both because lootable resources are something to directly value, and because they can fund the war effort elsewhere. And yes, sometimes cattle are the target. Within the developed world, though, this type of concern is a thing of the past for the vast majority of the population. Welcome to the era of the service economy. Food is abundant, and shelter is readily available. Well, at least the latter would be true if not for special interest restrictions. But that is NIMBY nonsense for another night. The point is, in the developed world, very few are worried that they are going to starve or freeze to death on any given day. It took a long time to get there, of course. Millennia of subsistence farming, virtually no surpluses, and little technological innovation. But once there, the advances came rapidly. Next up was the second agricultural revolution, with better tools and crop rotation systems to massively increase farmers' yields. Then came a pair of industrial revolutions, first defining industry as we know it, and then refining it with efficiency gains from production lines, interchangeable parts, more rapid communication, and faster transportation. Then, sometime in the middle of the 20th century, there was the Green Revolution, and the introduction of high-yield crops, improved fertilization, and better land management. The result? Well, for one thing, people now construct gardens for fun and donate food to the local fauna, both quaint notions to someone from 10 or 20 generations ago. For something a little more concrete, in 1800, back when John Adams was president and he lived in this building, 83% of Americans worked in agriculture. Today, the president lives here, and about 80% of Americans work in the service sector. The United States has some of the best farmland in the world, but agriculture is now an afterthought for most. In the European Union, it is 73% service. In Japan, it is also 73%. From an international security perspective, service economies are nothing like the world had ever seen before. Remember, back in the age of stationary bandits, if you wanted to be rich, you could just kill the ruler of some domain and usurp control over the local peasants. Even during the industrial age, you could take over the factories. Your choice on whether you want to try to keep the workers turning the cranks or, politely remove them and bring in your own crew? Because you certainly would not do anything more grisly than that. Now would you, my dear friendly viewer? But service economies? Here, the markets are dominated by the medical industry, education, hospitality, and entertainment. Ask yourself, how does one conquer Silicon Valley? It is not the silicon that is valuable there. Or Hollywood. It is not the wood that is valuable there. I mean, sure, you could physically capture both of them. But again, it is not the land itself that makes them valuable. No. What makes them valuable are the people who work there and design the latest microchips or apps. Or it is the people who write, act, and direct your favorite television show or film. Once upon a time, you could take over Pittsburgh and seize all of the assets of the world's largest company. Today, you would destroy one of the biggest hubs of medical research. All of the lines on maps would disappear overnight, and there goes the neighborhood. I guess you could try to enslave the population of a service economy and make us continue working. But what drives the service sector is creativity, and it is much, much harder to institute an overseer to police that. Take over this land, and you may end up destroying the cancer research that would have ultimately saved your life 10 years later. Just think about how long it is taking Grand Theft Auto 6 to come out. Enslave the developers at Rockstar Games, and you can say goodbye to that 2025 release date. We will be lucky to get a functional game by 2055. Another part of what drives the service sector is deep specialization. Again, that is hard for an overseer to police. Someone whose primary employable features are an intimidating demeanor and willingness to engage in violence is going to have a difficult time figuring out whether the mathematician is doing calculus properly. I myself have always wondered what it would be like to be forced to produce formal models of war. I think I would start doing the silliest thing possible, and delight in convincing my taskmaster that I am on the verge of a major scientific discovery. The thing is, this guy just does not know any better. He specializes in violence, and that is it. And that is going to be a problem for getting good work done. I could talk in circles to this guy for hours, and you would not have a clue. Or imagine calling an enslaved computer technician to fix your broken computer. Hey, the whole system is broken. You need to purchase a new one. Actually, it just needed a software update. Mineral and resource wealth can further enrich a country focused on its service sector, of course. Oil is oil, gold is gold. And if it is just sitting there in your own country waiting for the taking, then yeah, go ahead and extract it. But if it is way over there on the other side of the world, well, that is a different story. Chapter 5. The Cost of Conquest. Back to the oil and gold. It is not just that service economies are no longer bound by the value that they pull out of the ground. It is also that the opportunity cost of paying to extract material wealth from others has skyrocketed over time. This explains why the territorial peace is not limited to the internal confines of Western countries, but rather it also expands to Western disinterest in capturing places like the Panama Canal or the Middle East. As we often do, we turn to Saddam Hussein to help us here. Well, as much as Saddam can be helpful. In 1990, in a classic lines on maps miscalculation, Saddam decided that Kuwait was actually the 19th government of Iraq, and concluded that no one would really mind if he took over the area. Kuwait offered basically no resistance. A 3-day special military operation? Nope, it was over in 2. For the next 6 months, Saddam's cousin indeed administered Kuwait as the 19th government of Iraq. The plan was simple. Iraq was in poor financial position following the Iran-Iraq War. Kuwait, meanwhile, had a bunch of oil. Thus, Phase 1, extract the oil. Phase 2, sell the oil. Phase 3, profit. It is always a good start to have a coherent business model. But on February 24th, 1991, George H.W. Bush decided that he had had enough of Saddam. Thus began Operation Desert Storm's ground campaign. 4 days later, Kuwait returned to the map. And that is the interesting part of this. Saddam Hussein's troops ran over Kuwait, and Iraq tried to control the oil fields. The United States ran over Iraqi Kuwait, but ultimately said, no thank you, and handed the country back to the prior Kuwaiti regime. Fast forward 12 years, and Saddam was tinkering with weapons of mass destruction, or so the George W. Bush administration told us. Either way, the United States invaded Iraq, aiming to decapitate the regime. Less than a month and a half later, major combat operations were over. Mission accomplished. Well, we all know how that turned out in the long run. But the interesting part is that the United States once again found itself militarily dominating a region with extremely valuable oil wells, only to say, no thank you, we are good, and put them back under the ownership of the respective country. What separated Saddam from the United States? The feel-good story is that establishing the 51st state of Iraq would be morally wrong, and how dare the United States even consider the possibility. In contrast, a dictator like Saddam Hussein? Sure, he was not the family man that he tried to project. He might be enamored with territorial expansion and resource riches, and he would be willing to take the risk that comes with the military strategy all falling apart. But someone who lives here? No way. They would never. And yet, there was a more practical problem here for the United States. Back in 1991, it was not just the international coalition constraining Washington. Sure, the main combatants were many, and the broader coalition was gigantic. But the United States was doing the heavy lifting, and it would have been an interesting exercise to simply annex Kuwait and see what the coalition would do in response. You can see that more clearly in 2003, when only the United Kingdom, Australia, and Poland joined the ground invasion. And, to some degree, the 1991 situation gets the causation reversed. The reason that the giant coalition formed was because the United States could credibly commit to restraint. Did those coalition partners trust U.S. compliance with feel-good norms? Maybe. But if I may pivot to a more practical answer, it just was not worth the cost of conquest for Washington. The United States is one of the richest countries in the world on a per capita basis, reflecting a highly educated and highly productive workforce. On the other hand, military endeavors are inherently unproductive. Someone employed as a soldier is not creating wealth. Likewise, tanks, artillery pieces, fighter jets, and the like are not consumption goods. All of the resources that go into building them do not create wealth either. Sure, you may be able to extract someone else's wealth with the military. Certainly, that was Saddam's intention with Kuwait. But you are not creating wealth. For all the evidence you need for that, just take a look at what the Kremlin's wartime mobilization has done to the Russian economy. A dearth of consumer goods and rampant inflation is wrecking a once somewhat stable system. And the only thing keeping the country together is massive deficit spending, as well as one extremely competent central banker. On the flip side of the coin, even if you had no intention of extracting someone else's wealth, you would still want to invest in your military, lest the world get flipped upside down on you because you are an obvious target for more predatory countries. The lesson here, though, is that if you are a rich country and want to engage in conquest, then the conquered land had better pay handsomely. Otherwise, as a rule of thumb, you will need to deploy 1 soldier per 100 people in the occupied territory. The cost of doing so goes far beyond the roughly $90,000 in salaries that the United States spent per member of the armed forces in 2023. It is also all of the engineering, manufacturing, and support staff that go into deploying that many men and arming them properly. Never mind that running an occupation is a dirty business. Some of those soldiers will return dismembered, or never return at all. Either way, they will no longer be productively contributing to the economy. Compare that to a country like Saddam-era Iraq, a low-productivity economy, where it was relatively cheap to pull men off of the street to go patrol the Kuwaiti oil fields. Not much was lost, and there was a lot of black gold to be gained, before they had to leave and chose to set it all on fire. In any case, as an autocracy, the government was not particularly responsive to the masses, so death and dismemberment were not a stately concern. Rather, the process itself could be partially extractive, transforming the wellness capital of average Iraqis into petrodollars for the government. You can even see some of the wealth transfer mechanisms at play in Russia today. Part of the presumed motivation for the invasion of Ukraine is the potential for mineral wealth extraction in the eastern part of the country. Russia, though, is a relatively wealthy country on a per capita basis. The only way that this works is because there are massive geographic inequalities. Russians living in the European section of the country tend to be fairly well off. In contrast, those living in the vastness of Siberia and the rest of Asian Russia are rather poor. It is no surprise that the Kremlin is recruiting disproportionately from that second half, and even then the economics of the war are questionable. And that is perhaps the biggest problem of all with trying to take control of Greenland for its future mineral wealth, or reassert control over the Panama Canal. Could the United States do those things? Sure. That is what you get when you account for 37% of the entire world's defense expenditures. But as a general life lesson, feasibility should not be the question. What we really ought to ask ourselves is about the profitability. The moment that the United States tries to do something like that, resistance groups will form. It is inevitable because, for them, it is a question of profit. The local populations will be angry, and political entrepreneurs will see an opportunity. Do you know what is a good way to make a name for yourself, and drive donations and recruits to your cause? Committing spectacular attacks against the occupier. Now, put yourself in the shoes of the president. How do you stop this from happening? Generally speaking, you don't. You treat it as the cost of doing business and throw in some triage to limit the damage. Maybe you try paying the people to provide security on your behalf rather than side with the opponents, as you are seeing with these pictures from Iraq. But good luck with any of that given the targets in question that Trump has been floating. Greenland is so far away from the types of support bases that you would need, the situation is just laughable. And no, Bidufix Space Base does not count as a proper counterinsurgency post. That thing is tiny and only serves a narrow purpose to keep an eye out for incoming Russian missiles. It would be really helpful if Canada offered logistical support, but that sure as ain't happening. And do not even suggest a Maple Leaf 51st state solution, because that solves the problem by creating 10 more problems. Somehow the problem is worse with the Panama Canal. Suppose that the United States indeed reclaims it. Then what? The thing is only useful as a shortcut between the Pacific and Atlantic Oceans. What do you think is going to happen the moment someone starts bombing the canal itself, or striking the ships passing through it, or using nanofiber thread to cut them to shreds? Watch this video again. Look how long it takes. Any ship going through is a sitting duck. So, I ask again, what happens when the explosions start? Well, for one thing, better hope that you have a Red Cross ship coincidentally passing through at the same time. But over the long term, the answer is that no one is going to use the canal anymore, and we do not need to speculate on this. We know that will be the outcome from the Houthi situation over at the Bab el-Mandab Strait. The so-called Gates of Grief go to 32 kilometers at their narrowest. Over that distance, an enfeebled rebel group / proto-state has more than halved shipping traffic going through it, despite all sorts of military response from the United States. In contrast, some of the canal locks go down to just 33.5 meters. Again, that is meters, not kilometers. We could play a game of catch going across it if we really wanted to. Now imagine trying to convince an insurance company to offer coverage for your boat passing through, and that assumes that passage itself is still possible. The canal needs its locks to be functional. Target a door, target a pulling mechanism, target the controls, target whatever. It is done for. Take a look at the tactical situation surrounding the canal. It is open and would be a very attractive target to a militant group. Any fix would require a massive military overhaul, which would ironically expose more troops to danger. There is a reason why Jimmy Carter initiated a transfer process of the canal to Panama back in 1977. Yeah, the United States used to do that sort of territorial conquest thing, and the Stars and Stripes saw plenty of success doing it for a while. And it was not just on the North American continent either. Uncle Sam went overseas too. Expanding our scope, so did Europe, with its much longer colonial period. But by the time that World War II came around, thanks to all of those social, economic, and technological developments that we discussed earlier, the opportunity cost to deploy the soldiers necessary to do it over the long term just became too much. You might still fight on the land, but you would not fight over the land, per se. Don't bother trying to extract tolls from the Panama Canal. Instead, go home and do something more productive. If you want to extract mineral wealth from Greenland, go home, do something more productive, and then buy the minerals off of the global market. Heck, if you were on your best behavior, they may even ask for your technical assistance in mining them. Somehow, you will end up getting a cut anyway. Put bluntly, for a developed economy, conquest is more trouble than it is worth. Chapter 6. The Trump Strategy. So far, we have learned that the West has enjoyed 80 years of territorial peace. Military threats suppress economic growth. International trade makes the cost of war high. Service economies are hard to extract money from. And the act of conquest costs developed economies more than it pays. What does that buy us? Well, think about this from a lines on maps perspective, featuring old World War foes France and Germany. As usual, if you can reason through what the expected outcome of a war would be, then you can just implement something close to it and make everyone better off. That is because fighting will generate a similar outcome, but come with extra costs. All of those things that we discussed earlier? Some were prerequisites to reach the modern world. A big lesson was the sky-high cost of war, and the others devalued what could be won by fighting. But remember, the size of the bargaining space depends on how much you value the physical costs of war versus how much you value the prize. Make the prize less valuable, and you further expand out the implicit costs. Well, the sum of all of these factors basically pushed the costs of war well beyond what the two parties could plausibly want to negotiate over. At that point, a hypothetical mediator monkey throwing settlement darts at a map cannot help but hit a happy outcome. This, in the most basic sense, is why the Western territorial peace has lasted for decades. No eyeing the Panama Canal, no Greenland grabbing, no nothing. Trump's strategy adds a new wrinkle to the system, though, ironically trying to exploit the fact that so many divisions of what is at stake are better for both parties than conflict. And by conflict, I mean more than just the traditional interstate wars that we are used to. I am speaking more broadly to all sorts of inefficient processes, so things like tariffs and trade sanctions are included. In the past, the rule of thumb was that everyone sticks to the status quo, and no one threatens to disrupt it, lest we open a path to incurring all of those costs. You even see this idea enshrined into the NATO Charter. As a defensive alliance, it is designed to uphold the status quo, not act as an insurance policy for countries going on the offensive. But the Trump administration sees this as an opportunity to make demands along the zero-sum dimensions that remain, whether that be annexing parts of Greenland, reclaiming control over the Panama Canal, or whatever. And every tool seems to be available to accomplish his goals, from withholding military assistance to NATO countries that are not contributing sufficiently to the alliance, to massive tariffs that threaten to send the entire world into a recession. And it is hard to overstate the pain that the tariff strategy will cause. Remember the Smoot-Hawley bill, the harbinger of the Great Depression? The planned Trump tariffs are even larger. In fact, they are about 15 times larger than the tariffs from Trump's previous term. But the amount of pain that they will cause is even worse. Deadweight loss is the term that economists use for the foregone economic benefits that taxes create. You see, a tax is not simply a transfer of wealth from one party to another. It also causes some portion of the economic relationship to disintegrate, as some buyers cannot afford higher prices, and some sellers cannot turn a profit if the government is going to extract some of the sale price. What's worse is that the deadweight loss tends to increase in the square of the tax, because the buyer's decision and seller's decision are codependent. So, for example, if you make a tariff 15 times larger than before, it will be 225 times as painful. Individuals may have hardly noticed the previous Trump tariff, but the burdens this time around will be significant. You can already see this from what is happening on Wall Street. In the wake of the announcement, the S&P 500 index dropped about 10%. Bear in mind that this is not a situation where the United States will experience short-term pain for long-run gains. Ownership of a stock is a contract that gives its bearer a share of the company's future profits. Thus, you can think of the stock's price as the net present value of those profits. If the tariffs were going to help U.S. companies over the long run, the prices would be shooting up. Instead, they are doing the exact opposite. Of course, companies around the world are also feeling the pain, and international stock indices have correspondingly dropped too, though on average it has not been as bad for them, because the United States only accounts for a portion of their trade. The end sum of this is that the United States has initiated a game of chicken. Two cars are driving right at each other inside of a single lane, and there will be a disaster if one does not swerve out of the way. The rest of the world sees no reason to move. They are in the lane that they have always been in, after all. The social norms of the situation tell them that they ought not do anything. Meanwhile, Trump counters that he does not care about previous standards, and other countries will buckle to his demand of the day, or else. It is an extension of the domestic trend of Congress refusing to pass funding legislation and causing government shutdowns. Both sides suffer, but the key voters in Congress hope that the president suffers more and caves on the issue at stake. Well, here, Trump is causing a shutdown of the Western world, and he is betting that the United States' privileged economic position will mean that it can outlast everyone else. Other countries, though, see little point in throwing away a system that has worked for almost a century, and are betting that U.S. domestic dissatisfaction will eventually end the gambit. Those tumbling stocks have real effects on Americans' retirement accounts, and American consumers will notice the inflated prices on store shelves. And if the wrath of American citizens is not enough to force Trump to concede directly, then perhaps the end will come via congressional Republicans voting with Democrats to reassert control over foreign policy. The shadow of that threat is what convinced Trump to put a 90-day moratorium on the sanctions, combined with bond markets plummeting, implying a massive jump in the cost to service the U.S. national debt. The funny thing about the tariffs is that the administration calculated the rates largely based on manufacturing trade deficits. But, ironically, trade deficits leave foreign investors with excess dollars to spend, and they tend not to just dig a hole and leave their greenbacks in the ground. No, they try to invest it, and the easiest thing to buy is U.S. debt. That, in turn, keeps interest rates low. Tie tariffs to trade deficits, though, and you blow up your ability to receive loans. So much for your bargaining power. Meanwhile, those foreign leaders feel confident that they can politically survive, as many incumbent parties are experiencing a rally-round-the-flag effect, usually only seen in response to external military threats. They learn the lessons of Smoot-Hawley, and therefore they are not retaliating against each other. They can survive and still grow, while the United States' market tumbles and the country spirals toward North Korean-style autarky. Eventually, though, one side will emerge victorious within that civilizational argument. However, in the meantime, the West's longtime antagonists sit back and enjoy their main foe's self-destruction. What does not self-destruct are these two wonderful books about the war. They are made of paper, so that claim is true as long as you store them under 451 degrees Fahrenheit. Check the video description for more information about them. And if you enjoyed this video, please like, share, and subscribe, and I will see you next time. Take care.